Ladies and gentlemen, I think we may have just found a new contender for the absolute worst game of 2023. While everyone's out here talking about what's the best of the best, whether or not Baldur's Gate 3 or Tears of the Kingdom or something else is the best game of the year, people are only debating about which game is the cream of the crop. And while I do think that's all well and important, everyone has seemed to have forgotten about what goes on at the bottom of the barrel. I'm talking about the garbage dumps of the gaming industry, where all the worst games are discarded and forgotten about by the average gamer. And for a while, the recent Gollum game was the one that held the title of the worst game of the year. But very recently, a new challenger has come onto the scene to shake things up and dethrone Gollum from its title as King of Garbage. I know it's surprising, but I think we may have just found a new king to rule them all. And that game is called Skull Island: Rise of Kong. This game was just released very recently on Steam for a whopping $40 retail for the base game and $55 for the deluxe edition. And not only that, but this game has been met with some very favorable reviews. Now, not favorable to the developers, mind you, I mean favorable to me because it's more content as a connoisseur of trash video games. Now, before I talk about this game, let's talk about who's responsible for releasing this abomination out into the world. What kind of developer would even dare to challenge the King of Garbage in its own domain? Well, this brand new challenger gunning for the bottom is by a small development team based in Chile called Iguanabi and a publisher named Game Mill Entertainment. And surprisingly enough, these guys have been around the gaming industry for a bit of a while now, having a history of publishing games going as far back as 2015. So they've been in the business for about 8 years now, and what have they published during that near decade time span? Well, you see, they've been publishing some prime bottom tier garbage license games like the unanimously hated Nerf Legends or the incredibly horrible Avatar: The Last Airbender video game. And trust me when I say this, when it comes to trash video games, Game Mill Entertainment is very familiar with this field. They've basically been publishing unknown shovelware license games for the past 8 years they've been in business. So they've actually been around the block for a while now. That's not to say all of their games are terrible though. The most notable game they've published so far is the Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl game that was actually pretty decent, but unfortunately died out too early due to loss of interest and lack of funding. So they do have some hidden gems here and there, but for the most part, they specialize in churning out low quality trash. And that's what leads us to the current day, where Iguanabi has been cooking up something absolutely foul. Something so incredibly vile that it's straight up diabolical what these developers conjured up. And the funny thing is that this game didn't just come out of nowhere. We've actually known about this for a while now, because they've actually released a trailer for Skull Island: Rise of Kong a few months ago back in August. And boy did that trailer get some attention, garnering a staggering 9% like to dislike ratio. Pretty much everyone could see this train wreck coming from a mile away, and the devs knew that everybody thought this was trash, yet they still released it in the exact same state as it was in the trailer. Which leads us to today, where we finally get to play this dumpster fire and finally get to see this game in all of its disgusting glory. So, for the people who haven't heard of this game before, Rise of Kong is a spin-off game based on the King Kong IP that's supposed to be a sort of prequel to the movies, I guess. Look, I'm not really sure where on the King Kong chronological lore timeline this game lies, but what I do know is that this game is the backstory to Kong and how he rose to the iconic ape that he is today. What happens in the story is basically that Kong and his parents come from this dying race of gorillas who've been hunted and killed by the other inhabitants of Skull Island for generations now, until Kong and his parents were the last remaining ones of their kind. That is until one rainy day while the mother is out scavenging for food and the father was left alone to take care of the young Kong, was when they got attacked by this really powerful raptor named Gaw. And Gaw, being the big evil raptor that he is, killed both of Kong's parents right in front of his face while he helplessly watches from the sidelines. The now orphaned Kong then barely escapes with his life, all alone and parentless, left to fend for himself in this cruel world. This is where Kong vows to get stronger and avenge his parents by killing Gaw and ending his reign of terror once and for all. And that's basically the whole story. You just then play as a grown-up Kong as he kills random creatures on his journey to defeat Gaw. So basically you're playing as the Punisher, but a gorilla. There's not really much more to it. It's not really too complex of a story, but I will say though that the cutscenes are hilariously awful. They look like they were made by a college student who was just learning how to use Blender for the first time. Like, just look how this scene is animated. All the cutscenes in this game are just animated so poorly that I couldn't take any of them seriously with how bad the graphics are and how goofy the character models look. Now, obviously the graphics are horrible, there's really no debate here. But are they worse than Gollum's graphics? And in my opinion, I think they are worse than Gollum's graphics because it has this weird art style where everything looks like one of those knockoff toys you find at the dollar store or a random Chinese store you'll find in the back alley. Pretty much everything in this game looks like it was made out of really cheap plastic. Meanwhile, Gollum just looks like a really bad PS2 game. So Kong's actually got a leg up here. And what's funny is that there was also another King Kong game that was released back in 2005 that looks leagues better than this game that's released in 2023. That's right, Skull Island Rise of Kong manages to look worse than another Kong game that came out for the PS2 18 years ago. Now that right there is an achievement, and not one I would be too proud about. Now, Rise of Kong is an action game that features a fully in-depth combat system, and it's functional, kinda. It's got everything that you would expect from a standard action game that was released in the early 2000s. It's got a light attack, a heavy attack, a dodge, a parry, and even a sort of fury mode. It's got everything you could want in a combat system, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that half the stuff either doesn't work or just feels clunky to use. Both the light and heavy combos are slow and the animation locks you, so you can't cancel your attacks once you perform them, which makes the combat feel a lot slower and tedious because you'll just end up taking unnecessary damage even though you're spamming the dodge button. The parry is this shoulder tackle thing, but there's no feedback on whether you did it correctly or not, so you just kind of have to use it and hope that you did it correctly. You can also grab enemies and throw them, but since it's so janky, it only works half of the time. The other half of the time, you'll just drop the thing that you picked up. And it also just looks really goofy when you pick up an enemy because the devs didn't make a grab animation for any of them, so they just kind of chill there nonchalantly on your hand as you prepare to chuck them 5 feet away from you. Also, the rage mode takes way too long to activate and doesn't really feel like it gives you any tangible benefits. I think it only slightly increases your damage. There was just no gameplay mechanic in this game that felt good to use. Everything here felt half finished and poorly implemented, which is a good thing if this is trying to be the worst game of the year. And don't get me started on the lock-on system, which is literally broken. Whenever you lock onto an enemy, it doesn't readjust your controls based on who you target. It only makes your camera follow them. So what ends up happening is that whenever you lock onto your target, your controls will be inverted because Kong doesn't immediately turn to face the enemy like in every other game. So in other words, the lock-on mechanic is essentially worthless. A lot of the time I was fighting the controls more than I was the bosses. Sometimes this game felt harder than a Souls game, and not in a good way. I don't know how you can mess something so simple up, but these devs have managed to do it. Speaking of messing things up, the devs have also messed up the map because it's basically useless. I mean, sure, it shows you all the areas in it, but it doesn't tell you where you are in relation to the map, so you don't actually know where you are at any point during the game. Which is kind of a problem if you get lost and you have no idea where to go. And that happens pretty often in this game because every area looks exactly the same and there are no objective markers on the map. The game just has this really awful roar thing that you can do that's supposed to show you the way, but it only sometimes shows you the way. And when it does, it only shows you the general direction of where you're supposed to go, not how to get there. So you might as well just wander around like a headless chicken until you stumble across the objective, because that's way more effective than whatever this roar thing is. And what are these objectives that I'm talking so much about? Well, you see, throughout the map, there are these areas where you're given a random objective, such as clear the area or destroy all nests, you know, something like that. And what happens when you clear an objective is that you get a skill point for your skill tree. Yes, to everyone's surprise, this game actually has a skill tree. And to be honest, it's sort of thought out too, as there are these sort of pathways you can choose in order to tailor your gameplay to your own preferences. I can see what they're trying to do here, and it's a pretty decent attempt to add some depth to this game, but unfortunately a lot of the stuff on the skill tree is pretty useless because they give upgrades to bad mechanics like less end lag on the parry animation or something to that effect. Now the problem with the objectives giving you skill points is that they're the only things that give you skill points. Killing the random trash monsters gives you nothing. So the most efficient way to play this game is to just run past everything and get to the activities as fast as possible, because fighting these random mobs littered throughout the map is just not worth it. And of course, this game can't be an action game without bosses, and the bosses were not as bad as I expected, surprisingly enough. I thought they would be complete trash with no redeemable qualities whatsoever, but I could see that the developers actually did try here. Like, the bosses have a couple of unique mechanics with multiple different phases and a bunch of different attacks. For example, the sandworm boss has the dig attack, and when it pops out of the ground, it spawns a rock nearby, which you can use to make the worm slam and stun itself on, and in my opinion, that's actually pretty cool. Look, I know my standards are really low here, but the devs didn't have to do this and just make the boss a reskinned normal enemy. Now, it's not Elden Ring by any stretch of the imagination, and there are still a lot of problems with them, like the boss attacks are poorly telegraphed and you never know when they're about to hit you. There's also only a total of 5 bosses in this game, which is incredibly low, and it'll probably take you around 5 hours to beat the entire game. But A+ for effort, I guess. So with that being said, do I think Skull Island Rise of Kong is the worst game of the year? Honestly, this is probably going to be an unpopular opinion here, but I don't think this game is worse than Gollum. You see, while Rise of Kong is an awful game, it's more of the it's so bad it's good type of bad, where you can just have a good laugh with your friends at how horrible everything is. Meanwhile, the Gollum game is just bad and boring, which is the worst kind of shovelware game. I feel like if Rise of Kong released back in 2004, it actually would have been a pretty decent game, whereas Gollum would have never been a good game in no matter what time period it was released. But that's just my opinion. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Let me know down below and make sure to like, comment, subscribe for more content in the future. See ya.